Hey friends, if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It's one of the most powerful ways you can help the channel grow. Every like, comment, and share that you leave in the first few hours of a video tells YouTube that our stories are worth pushing to a bigger audience. With your support, I know we can get to 25,000 subscribers by Halloween. Remember, we never have ads in the middle of our stories. And don't forget, if you want to rep The Darkest Hour, visit thedarkesthourYT.com for exclusive merch you won't find anywhere else. Thanks for being part of this journey. Now, on with the show. The Empty House, written by Algernon Blackwood. Certain houses, like certain people, somehow manage to instantly announce themselves as evil. No single feature is to blame. Someone might be charming and attractive, but after getting to know each other, you see something drastically wrong with them. They reveal secret and wicked thoughts that make others avoid them like a plague. Perhaps it is the same with houses, and the evil deeds committed under a single roof are what gives us chills and raise our hair. Maybe some of the evil person's hatred and their victim's horror are left behind. It could affect the new occupants, making them feel nervous or frightened for no apparent reason. Nothing about this particular house hinted at the horror that happened inside. It was neither lonely nor dirty. It stood on a crowded corner of the square and looked identical to the houses on either side. They all had the same number of windows, a balcony over the garden, and white steps leading up to a heavy black front door. Even the number of chimneys, the angle of the eaves, and the height of the railings were the same. In the back was a narrow strip of green, with brick borders running up the wall to separate it from the adjoining houses. Yet, despite seeming so similar to its 50 ugly neighbors, this house was horribly different. It's impossible to say exactly where this invisible difference is. It cannot be entirely the imagination, because too many people have stayed there without knowing its history. Even they claimed that certain rooms were so awful, they'd rather die than return. The house's very atmosphere created a feeling of genuine terror, and the innocent people who tried to live there were forced to leave with hardly any notice. The town practically considered it a scandal. When Shorty arrived to pay a visit to his Aunt Julia at her little house by the sea, he found her bursting with excitement. He received a telegram from her that morning and expected the visit to be boring. But the moment he kissed her wrinkled cheek, he felt her energy like an electrical wave. The sensation grew when he learned that there would be no other visitors. He was summoned for a very special reason. Something was in the wind, and it would certainly prove useful. This spinster aunt had a passion for psychic research, brains, and willpower. She was known to accomplish her goal by any means necessary. The secret was revealed after tea, and Julia stood close to him as they slowly paced along the beach at dusk. "I've got the keys," she announced, in a delightful yet disbelieving way. "Got them till Monday." "The keys to the changing room, or?" he asked innocently, looking from the sea to town. Nothing brought her to the point quicker than feigning stupidity. "Neither," she whispered. "I've got the keys to the haunted house on the square, and I'm going there tonight." Shorty felt a slight chill down his back and stopped joking. Something in her voice and behavior stunned him. She was serious. "But you can't go alone," he began. That's why I sent for you," she said confidently. He turned and saw that her old, ugly, mysterious face was filled with happiness. There was a glow of genuine enthusiasm around it, like a halo, and her eyes were shining brightly. He felt another wave of her excitement, and a second, stronger chill came with it. "Thanks, Aunt Julia," he said politely. "Thanks so much." "I wouldn't dare go alone," she raised her voice. "But I'll enjoy it very much with you. You're not afraid of anything." "Thanks so much," he repeated. Is it likely that anything will happen?" "A great deal has already happened, though it's been covered up very well. 3 occupants have come and gone in the last few months, and it's said that the house will stay empty from now on," she whispered. In spite of himself, Shorty became interested. His aunt was deathly serious. "The house is very old indeed," she continued, "and the unpleasant story dates a long way back. It involves a murder committed by a jealous stableman who had an affair with a house servant. One night, he managed to sneak into the cellar when everyone was asleep. He crept upstairs to the servants' quarters, chased the girl down to the next landing, and before anyone could help, he threw her over the rail into the hall below." "And the stableman?" "Well, he was caught and hanged for murder, but it happened a century ago. I haven't been able to get any more details." Shorty's interest was now thoroughly piqued. While he was not particularly worried for himself, he was a little concerned for his aunt. "On one condition," he said. "Nothing will stop me from going," she said firmly. "But I might as well hear your condition." "You must guarantee that you'll be able to control yourself if anything really happens. That you're sure you won't get too frightened." "Jim, I'm not young and neither are my nerves. But with you, there's nothing in the world for me to fear," she said. This, of course, settled it. Shorty had no hope of ever being more than an ordinary young man. Any praise implying otherwise was irresistible. He agreed to go. By subconsciously preparing himself, he remained in control of his fear for the whole evening. He imagined packing up his emotions and locking them away. The process is difficult to describe, but wonderfully effective. All men who have lived through severe hardship will understand. Later, it served his reputation well. It was 10:30 when they left the comfortably lit hallway of his aunt's home, and Shorty had to hold back his fear for the first time. When the door was closed, he saw the silent, empty street, bathed in white moonlight, and realized that the real test would be dealing with 2 fears. He would need to carry his aunt's as well as his own. Glancing down at her expression, which was difficult to interpret, he realized that it would not become any easier in a rush of real terror. He could only be confident of one thing: his ability to stand firm against any shock that might come. Slowly, they walked along the town's empty streets. A bright autumn moon painted the roof silver and cast deep shadows all around. There was no wind, and the trees lining the beach watched in silence as they passed. Shorty did not reply to his aunt's occasional remarks. He understood that she was mentally preparing, distracting herself from thinking unnatural thoughts. Few windows were lit, and smoke rose from even fewer chimneys. Shorty was already noticing these small details when they stopped at the corner to read the name on the house. Without speaking, they turned into the square and walked to the side that lay in shadow. "The house number is 13. Neither of them said more about the obvious reference. Instead, they continued walking in silence. Halfway across the square, Shorty felt an arm slip quietly but purposefully into his own, and he knew that their adventure had truly begun. His aunt was already succumbing to the house's influence. She needed support. A few minutes later, they stopped in front of a narrow, ugly-shaped house that rose tall into the night and was painted a dingy white. The windows, which were missing their shutters and blinds, stared down on them. Shining in the moonlight, there were weather streaks in the walls, cracks in the paint, and the balcony bulged out from the first floor unnaturally. But the pitiful appearance did nothing to warn of such an evil character. Checking over their shoulders to ensure they were not followed, they ascended the steps with confidence and stood against the huge, foreboding black door. They were hit with a wave of nervousness, and Shorty fumbled with the key for a long time before getting it into the lock. For a moment, they both hoped that it would not open. They felt various unpleasant emotions as they stood on the threshold of their ghostly adventure. Shorty, struggling with the key and hindered by the weight on his arm, felt the importance of the moment. It was as if the whole world were watching through his eyes and listening to the grating noise. A stray puff of wind wandered down the empty street and rustled the trees behind them. Otherwise, the rattling key was the only sound. Finally, it turned in the lock, and the heavy door swung open to reveal a large gulf of darkness. With a last glance at the moonlit square, they quickly went inside, and the door slammed with a roar that echoed through the empty halls. Another sound was heard, and Aunt Julia suddenly leaned on her nephew hard enough to knock him off balance. He had to take a step back to avoid falling down. A man had coughed right next to them, in the darkness. Thinking it could be a prank, Shorty quickly swung his heavy stick toward the sound, but nothing was there. His aunt gave a little gasp. "There's someone here. I heard him," she whispered. "Be quiet. It was only the front door," he said sternly. "Oh, quick, get a light," she added as he fumbled with a box of matches and opened it upside down. They all fell on the stone floor with a rattle. The sound was not repeated, and there was no evidence of retreating footsteps. Soon they lit a candle in the end of a cigar case as a holder. He held up the makeshift lamp and studied their surroundings. Everything about it was dreary. There's nothing more desolate than a dark, forsaken, empty house. Yet it was also filled with memories of violence and evil. They were standing in a wide hallway. On their left was the open door of a spacious dining room, and straight ahead, the hall narrowed into a long, dark passage that led to the top of the kitchen stairs. The staircase rose before them, draped in shadows, except for a spot halfway up where the moon shone through the window. Its light was surrounded by a faint glow, giving the objects it touched a misty outline that created a haunted atmosphere better than total darkness. As Shorty continued staring, he thought of the countless empty rooms upstairs, and he longed for the safety of the moonlit square or his aunt's cozy home. Then, realizing those thoughts were dangerous, he locked them away again and focused all of his concentration on the present. "Aunt Julia, we must search the whole house, thoroughly," he said forcefully. The echoes of his own voice slowly died away, and in the intense silence that followed, he turned to look at her. In the candlelight, he saw that her face was ghastly pale, but she dropped his arm, stepped in close, and whispered, "I agree. First, we must be sure that there's no one hiding in here." It took her some effort to speak, and he looked at her with admiration. "Are you sure? It's not too late." "I think so," she whispered, her eyes shifting nervously to the shadows behind them. "Quite sure." There's only one thing. What's that? You must never leave me alone. Not for an instant. As long as you understand that anything we see or hear must be investigated immediately, hesitating would be the same as admitting we're frightened, and that could be deadly. Agreed, she said shakily. I'll try. Arm in arm, Shorty held the dripping candle while Julia carried his cloak over her shoulders. They would have made a funny sight to anyone else as they began their search. They entered the big dining room first, walking on tiptoes and shielding the candle to avoid being seen through the window. There was no furniture, only bare walls, ugly mantelpieces, and empty fireplaces. They felt like everything resented their intrusion and was watching them with hidden eyes. Whispers followed them. Shadows darted around silently, and it always seemed as if something were standing right behind them, waiting for an opportunity to hurt them. There was a sense that whatever normally occurred in the empty house had been paused until they were out of the way again. The entire building's dark interior seemed to become a malignant presence. It rose up, warning them to mind their own business, and the strain on their nerves increased every moment. From the gloomy dining room, they passed through large folding doors into a sort of library or smoking room. It was equally as silent, dark, and dusty. From there, they returned to the hall near the top of the back stairs. Here, a pitch-black tunnel opened into the lower regions, and they only hesitated for a minute, with the worst of the night still to come. It was essential to search every area. Aunt Julia stumbled on to the top step. Their descent was poorly lit by the flickering candle, and even Shorty almost tripped. Come on, he demanded, voice echoing off into the dark, empty space below. I'm coming, she faltered, grabbing his arm rougher than necessary. They descended the stone steps unsteadily. The air was cold, damp, smelly. The stairs led along a narrow passage and into a large kitchen with high ceilings. It had several doors. Some belonged to closets with empty jars on the shelves, and others led to horrible, creepy offices, each colder and less inviting than the last. Black beetles scurried around, and when Shorty bumped against a table in the corner, something the size of a cat jumped down, scampering across the stone floor and into the darkness. There was a gloomy sadness everywhere, a sense that someone had just been there. Leaving the kitchen, they went towards the scullery, where dishes and cleaning were once done. The door was slightly open, and as they pushed it wider, Aunt Julia screamed. She instantly tried to stifle it with one hand over her mouth. For a second, Shorty stood completely still, catching his breath. His spine felt as if it had been hollowed out and filled with ice. Standing directly across from the doorway, facing them, stood the figure of a woman. She had messy hair, wild, staring eyes, and her terrified face was white as death. She stood motionless for a single second. Then the candle flickered, and she was gone. In the door there was nothing but empty darkness. It was only the beastly candlelight jumping, he said quickly, in a half-controlled voice that sounded like someone else's. Come on, there's nothing here. He dragged her forward, and they tried to seem brave as they continued, but Shorty's skin crawled as if covered in ants. He knew by the weight on his arm that he was supplying the strength for both of them. The scullery room was cold, bare, and empty, more like a large prison cell than anything else. They walked around it, trying the windows and the doors to the yard, but they were all locked. His aunt moved like someone in a dream. Her eyes were squeezed shut, and she seemed to merely follow his arm. Her courage amazed him. At the same time, he noticed an odd change had come over her face, a change which he could not quite define. "There's nothing here, Auntie," he quickly repeated. "Let's go upstairs and see the rest of the house. Then we'll choose a room to wait in." She followed him obediently, staying close as they locked the kitchen door behind them. It was a relief to go up again. The moon had traveled further downstairs, making the hall brighter than before. Carefully, they entered the dark vault of the upper floors, with the boards creaking under their weight. They found 2 large living rooms, but a search of them revealed nothing. Again, there was no furniture or signs of recent occupation. Nothing but dust, neglect, and shadows. They opened the big folding doors between the 2 rooms and came out onto the landing before continuing upstairs. They had not gone more than a dozen steps when they both stopped to listen, looking anxiously at each other across the flickering candle. From the room they had just left came the sound of quietly closing doors. There was absolutely no question. They heard the booming noise that the heavy doors made when shutting, and the sharp sound of a latch catching. "We must go back and see," Shorty said in a low tone, turning to go. Somehow she managed to drag after him, her feet catching in her dress and her face livid. When they entered the front living room, it was obvious that the folding doors had been closed. Without hesitation, Shorty reopened them. He almost expected to see someone facing him in the back room, but he was only met with darkness and cold air. They went through both rooms and found nothing unusual. They tried everything they could think of to make the doors close by themselves, but there was not even enough wind to disturb the candle flame. The doors would not move without a strong force, and it was undeniable that the rooms were empty, and the house was completely still. "It's beginning." Shorty hardly recognized his aunt's voice as she whispered at his elbow. He nodded in agreement, checking his watch to note the time. It was 15 minutes before midnight. He wrote exactly what happened in his little notebook, setting the candle on the floor in order to do so. It only took a moment to balance it against the wall. Aunt Julia always said that she was not actually watching him at that moment. She turned toward the inner room where she heard something moving, but both agreed that they heard running footsteps, very fast and heavy. Then the candle went out. Only Shorty saw more than this, and he has always been grateful for that. As he rose from his stooping position of balancing the candle, but before it was actually extinguished, a face rushed forward, so close to his own that he could have kissed it. A man's face was filled with passion, had thick, dark features, and angry, savage eyes. It belonged to a common man, but it was bursting with intense, aggressive emotions. It wore a malignant and terrible expression. The air was completely still. There was no movement aside from the muffled sound of running feet, the apparition's face, and the extinguishing of the candle. Shorty let out a cry, nearly losing his balance as his aunt clung to him with her full weight in a moment of terror. Fortunately, she'd not seen the face. She was able to regain control almost immediately. After he was able to get free, he struck a match. The glare chased away the shadows on all sides as his aunt knelt to retrieve a cigar case with the precious candle. Then, they discovered that the candle had not been blown out at all. It had been crushed out. The wick was pressed down into the wax, which had flattened. It was flattened by something smooth and heavy. How his companion overcame her terror so quickly, Shorty never properly understood. But his admiration for her increased tenfold and inspired his own courage. For that, he was undeniably grateful. The evidence of physical force that they had just witnessed was equally unexplainable. He immediately suppressed memories of hearing about physical mediums and their dangerous phenomena. If those were true, and either himself or his aunt was unknowingly a medium, it meant that they were helping to focus the forces of a haunted house already at full charge. It was like carrying an open flame among uncovered supplies of gunpowder. So, with almost no thought, he simply relit the candle and proceeded to the next floor. The arm in his trembled, and his own steps were uncertain, but they continued being thorough. After the search revealed nothing, they climbed the last flight of stairs to the top floor. Here, they found a cluster of small servant rooms with broken furniture, dirty chairs, cracked mirrors, and a decrepit bedstand. The rooms had low, sloped ceilings, cobwebs, small windows, and badly painted walls. It was a depressing and dismal area that they were glad to leave behind. They entered a small room on the third floor at the stroke of midnight and prepared to make themselves comfortable for the night. It was totally empty and once used as a closet. It was said to be where the infuriated groom had caught his victim. Outside, across the narrow landing, began the stairs leading to the servants' quarters, where they had just searched. Despite the cold outside, there was something in the air that cried for an open window. But there was more. Shorty could only describe it by saying that he felt less in control of himself here than in any other part of the house. There was something that preyed directly on the nerves, wearing down one's resolve and weakening his will. It took less than 5 minutes in the room to realize this, and it was during that time that he lost all of his energy, which, for him, was the worst scare of the whole experience. They put the candle on the floor, leaving the door open a few inches so that there was no glare to confuse their eyes and no shadows to dart around. Then, they spread a cloak on the floor. They sat down to wait with their backs against the wall. Shorty was within 2 feet of the door. He had a good view of the main staircase leading down into darkness and the start of the servants' stairs going to the floor above. His heavy stick laid nearby within easy reach. The moon was high above the house. Through the window they could see the comforting stars like friendly eyes watching from the sky. One by one, the clocks in town struck midnight, and when the sounds died away, the deep silence of a windless night fell over everything. Only the faraway boom of the sea was heard as hollow murmurs. Inside, the silence was awful. Any minute, it could be broken by terrifying sounds. The strain of waiting was harder on the nerves. They whispered when they talked. Their voices sounded odd and unnatural. The chill in the room was not completely due to the night air, and it made them cold. Whatever was influencing them slowly stole their confidence and their ability to make decisions. Their self-control was declining, and the possibility of real fear took on a new, terrible meaning. Shorty trembled with worry for the elderly woman by his side. Her stubbornness could only protect her against so much. He heard the blood pumping in his veins. Sometimes it was so loud that he thought it was preventing him from hearing other sounds coming from deeper within the house. Every time he focused his attention on these noises, they stopped instantly and never came any closer. He couldn't shake the idea that something was moving in the lower parts of the house. The living room floor, where the doors were strangely closed, was too close. The sounds were further away than that. He thought of the kitchen, and its scurrying black beetles, and of the dismal scullery. But they didn't seem to come from there either. Surely they were not outside of the house. Suddenly he understood the truth, and for an entire minute he felt as if his blood had turned to ice. The sounds were not downstairs at all. They were upstairs, somewhere among those horrid, gloomy servant rooms with their broken furniture and low ceilings, where the victim was first awakened and chased to her death. The moment he realized where the sounds were coming from, he began to hear them more clearly. It was the sound of stealthy feet, walking along the passage overhead, through the rooms and around the furniture. He turned quickly to peek at the motionless figure beside him, to see if she had realized the same thing. The faint candlelight shining through the crack in the closet door illuminated her expressive face against the white wall. But it was something else that stole his breath and caused him to stare. She wore an extraordinary expression. It spread over her features like a mask and smoothed out the wrinkles. With the exception of her old eyes, she appeared quite young again. He stared, speechless and amazed, an amazement that was dangerously close to horror. It was indeed his aunt's face, but from 40 years ago. It was the blank, innocent face of a girl. He knew stories about the strange effect terror could have on someone. It consumes them, dominating all their emotions. Shorty never realized that it could be literal, or that it could mean anything as horrible as what he saw now. The dreadful signs of total fear were written all over her face, and when she felt his intense gaze, she turned to him, but he instinctively closed his eyes to avoid the sight. When he regained control of his emotions and turned a minute later, he was relieved to see a different expression. His aunt was smiling, and though her face was deathly white, the awful veil was gone, and her normal look was returning. "Anything wrong?" It was the only thing he could think to say, and the answer was persuasive. "I feel cold and a little frightened," she whispered. He offered to close the window, but she grabbed him, begged him not to leave her side even for an instant. "It's upstairs, I know," she whispered, with an odd laugh. "But I can't possibly go up." Shorty thought otherwise. He knew taking action was their best hope of maintaining self-control. He poured a glass of brandy from his flask. It was strong enough to help anybody through anything, and she swallowed it with a shiver. Now, his only plan was to get out of the house before her inevitable collapse. But they could not safely run away. Doing nothing was no longer an option. He was losing more composure every minute, and it became necessary to use desperate, aggressive measures without further delay. It was unavoidable, and they would need to show great confidence when facing the enemy. He could do it now, but in 10 minutes, he might not have the strength left. Upstairs, the sounds were growing louder and closer, accompanied by the occasional creaking floorboards. Someone was sneaking around and bumping into the furniture. Waiting for the numerous spirits to finish their work, Shorty stood quietly and said in his determined voice, "Now, Aunt Julia, we'll go upstairs, find out what's making all this noise. You must come too. It's what we agreed." He picked up his stick and fetched the candle. A limp figure rose shakily beside him. Breathing hard and very faint, she said, "Ready." The woman's courage amazed him. It was much greater than his own. They moved forward with the dripping candle, and this trembling, white-faced old woman was the true source of his courage. It held something that both shamed and supported him. Without it, he would have failed long before. They crossed the dark landing, averting their eyes from the deep, black space over the handrails. Then they ascended the narrow staircase to locate the sounds which were still growing louder and nearer. Halfway up the stairs, Aunt Julia stumbled, and Shorty caught her by the arm. At that moment, there was a loud crash in the servants' quarter above. It was immediately followed by a shrill, agonized scream. It sounded like a cry of terror and a plea for help mixed together. Before they could move aside or go down a single step, someone came rushing towards them from above, taking the stairs 3 at a time. The steps were light and uncertain, but close behind was a second and heavier set of them. They were walking, and it shook the whole staircase. Shorty and his companion had just enough time to flatten themselves against the wall when the jumble of flying feet reached their location, and 2 people dashed through the tiny gap between them at full speed. It was a midnight whirlwind of sounds crashing through the empty building. The 2 runners kept going, and they were already racing across the creaking floorboards below. But Shorty and his aunt saw absolutely nothing. Not a hand, an arm, face, or even a shred of clothing. There was a pause before the one being chased ran into the room which Shorty and his aunt had just left. The heavier one followed, and there was a scuffling sound, with smothered screaming. And then came the step of a single, heavy person on the landing. A dead silence followed for half a minute before they heard the sound of rushing air. It was followed by a dull, crashing thud on the lower floors of the house. It was total silence after. Nothing moved. The candle's flame was steady, and the air was undisturbed, filled with terror. Aunt Julia began fumbling her way downstairs without waiting for her nephew. She was crying softly to herself, and when Shorty put his arm around her, he could feel her shaking like a leaf. He retrieved the cloak from the little room's floor, and they marched down the 3 flights of steps very slowly, without speaking or turning. They saw nothing in the hall, but the whole way down, they were aware that someone was following them. When they went faster, it was left behind, and when they went slower, it caught up. Never once did they look back. At each turn on the staircase, they lowered their eyes to avoid the horror they might see above. With trembling hands, Shorty opened the front door. They walked out into the moonlight and breathed in the cool night air blowing in from the sea. A Madman, written by Maurice Level. He was not evil or cruel, but he craved the unknown. He was not a fan of the theater, yet he often went in hopes of seeing it burn down. He was not interested in the circus either, though he went in case one of the animals mangled its trainer. Once he even visited the bull ring, but bloodshed in a controlled setting was too dull, and he was disgusted by pointless suffering. He wanted the thrill of a sudden catastrophe. Then, after a 10-year wait, a fire ravaged the opera house. He escaped without injury, and it was not long before he also witnessed a famous lion tamer being torn to pieces by his own cats. The madman was only a few feet away from the cage when it happened, and, unable to match that thrill again, he fell into a deep depression until the morning he discovered gaudy posters littering the streets of Paris. The background was blue, and a strange, slanted racetrack ran down a ways, curled into a loop, and dropped straight down. The top of the poster showed a tiny cyclist about to dare the dangerous route, and the newspapers said a man actually intended to attempt such a course. When I reach the loop, you'll actually see me go upside down, he told reporters. The press was invited to inspect the track and the bicycle. I use no mechanical tricks, only precise scientific calculation and my unshakable nerve, the daredevil bragged. When the madman read the article, his good spirits returned. He purchased his ticket immediately, and to ensure that he was not distracted when the rider looped the loop, he purchased the entire box of seats across from the track and sat alone on the big night. The cyclist appeared high above the audience at the top of the track. After a tense moment of anticipation, he sped down the slope and circled the loop with his feet in the air. And then it was all over. The madman was thrilled by the performance, but he would only be able to enjoy the show a couple more times before becoming bored. Still, bicycles break, tracks wear out, and no man's skills are perfect. Sooner or later, there must be an accident. The cyclist was scheduled to perform in Paris for 3 months, and then he was going to tour the provinces. The madman decided to attend every single performance, even if he had to follow the show when it traveled. He bought the same box and sat in the same seat every night. One evening, 2 months later, the madman was leaving after a performance when he saw the cyclist standing alone in a corridor and approached him. Before he could say a word, the daredevil greeted him kindly. "I know you. You come to my show every night." "That's true. Your remarkable stunt is fascinating. But who told you about me?" "No one," the cyclist smiled. "I see you at each performance." "But how can you see me from so high up? Are you actually able to study the audience at such a moment?" The cyclist laughed. "Hardly. It would be dangerous to look down at a crowd, but just between us, there's a little trick to what I do." "A trick?" The madman was surprised and disappointed. No, I don't mean a hoax. But there's something the public doesn't know." The cyclist winked. "This will be our little secret, yes? You see, this stunt requires total concentration, which can be very intimidating since it's nearly impossible for me to clear my mind of random thoughts. Plus, the greatest danger comes from losing my balance if I were to start looking around. But I have a wonderful strategy to avoid this. I choose one spot in the auditorium and focus all my attention there. The first time I rode in this hall, I used you as my spot. And then you were here again the following evening, and the next. At the next show, the madman sat in his usual seat, and a hush fell over the excited fans when the cyclist made his entrance. He was only a black speck standing high above the audience. 2 men held his bicycle as the daredevil gripped the handlebars, stared out over the heads of the crowd, and shouted the signal. The men gave him a shove, and at that instant, the madman stood up and walked to the opposite side of the box. The audience screamed as the cyclist and his bike shot off the track and plunged into the crowd. The madman put on his coat, smoothed his hat against one sleeve, and left. The Room in the Tower, written by E.F. Benson. It is probable that every lucid dreamer has had at least one dream come true. In my opinion, it would be more strange if it did not happen occasionally. Our dreams involve people we know, places we're familiar with, events that naturally occur anyway. It is true they might include impossible or absurd details. But based on peer statistics, it's not unlikely for some to come true. For example, not long ago, one of my unremarkable dreams came true. And I'll tell you what happened. A friend of mine who lives abroad is kind enough to write me every couple of weeks. When that much time has passed, I know to expect a letter soon. One night last week, I dreamed that I was going upstairs to dress for dinner when the mailman knocked on the door. I went downstairs, and among my other letters was one from my friend. After that is when the absurd part happened. When I opened it, there was an ace of diamonds inside, and written on it was, "I'm sending you this for safekeeping. You know it is risky to keep aces in Italy." The next evening, just as I was preparing to go upstairs and dress for dinner, I heard the mailman knock, and did precisely as I had in my dream. Among the letters was one from my friend, but it did not contain the ace of diamonds. If it had, I would have been more impressed. But this was a perfectly ordinary coincidence. Obviously, I consciously or subconsciously expected a letter from him, which is what influenced my dream in the first place. Also, the fact that my friend had not written for 2 weeks influenced him to do so in the same way, although sometimes it is much harder to explain, and for the following story, I can find no explanation at all. It came out of the dark, and into the dark it has gone again. All my life, I've been a lucid dreamer. I spend my nights in a series of long, dazzling adventures. They're almost always pleasant, though most are trivial. The story I'm about to share is a rare exception. I was about 16 the first time I had the dream. It started with me at the door of a big red brick house. The servant who greeted me said tea was being served in the garden, and he led me through a low, dark hall with a large fireplace to a cheerful green lawn with flower beds. A small gathering was grouped around the tea table, but I only knew one person. He was an old classmate named Jack Stone, and his father owned the house. He introduced me to his parents and 2 sisters, and I was somewhat surprised. I hardly knew the boy and rather disliked what little I did know. Plus, he quit school the previous year. The afternoon was stifling hot, and the yard was bothered by a red brick wall with an iron gate in the center and a walnut tree just beyond it. We sat in the house's shadow across a row of windows, and inside I could see a table glimmering with glass and silver. The front of the house was very long, and at one end was a 3-story tower. It looked much older than the rest of the building. Soon, Mrs. Stone, who had sat in absolute silence like everyone else, said, "Jack will show you to your room at the top of the tower." For some inexplicit reason, my heart sank at her words. It was like I had already known that I would get that room, and there was something important yet dreadful about it. Jack got up instantly, and I knew I had to follow him. We passed through the hall in silence and went up a great oak staircase with many corners before arriving at a small 2-door landing. He pushed one open and closed it behind me. Then I knew my suspicion was correct. Something awful was in the room, and my fear grew quickly until I woke in a fit of terror. I experienced variations of that dream at random intervals for 15 years, but it usually happened exactly as I said. After arriving, tea is served in the silent garden before that one terrible sentence is spoken. Jack Stone always guides me through the horrifying tower, and the nightmare ends with some unseen terror in the room. Other times, it is a variation of the same thing. Occasionally, we'll be eating in the dining room, but it remained silence with the same suffocating dread, no matter where we were. The silence would always be broken by Miss Stone saying, "Jack will show you to your room at the top of the tower." Then I would follow him up the square staircase and enter the place I feared more and more each time. Otherwise, I would find myself playing cards in the silent den lit with enormous blinding chandeliers. I have no idea what the game was. I only remember feeling miserably anxious that Mrs. Stone would send me to the tower soon. The den was next to the brightly lit dining room, but the rest of the house was dim and full of shadows. Despite the bright lights, I often had a hard time seeing the cards that were dealt to me. Their colors were strange. There were no red suits, only black. And some cards were completely black all over. I hated and dreaded those. As this dream continued to recur, I became familiar with most of the house. Beyond the den, there was a smoking room with a green door at the end of the hall. It was always very dark, and I would pass somebody that I couldn't see as they were coming out. Over the years, characters in the dream aged as people might in real life. When I first saw Mrs. Stone, she had black hair, moved briskly, but now she was gray and feeble. Jack grew into a rather sickly young man with a brown mustache, and one of the sisters stopped appearing when she was married. Then I did not have the dream for 6 months or more. I began to hope that they were over with, but one night after this break, I found myself being escorted onto the lawn for tea once again. Mrs. Stone was not there, and the others were all dressed in black. I guessed the reason immediately, and my heart leapt at the thought that I would not have to sleep in the tower room. Though we normally sat in silence, the sense of relief made me talk and laugh as I never had before. But even then it was uncomfortable. No one else spoke. They only shared secret glances with each other. Soon, my foolish talk ran dry, and as the light slowly faded, I grew more anxious than in any previous visit. Suddenly, a familiar voice broke the silence. It was Mrs. Stone saying, "Jack will show you to your room at the top of the tower." It seemed to come from somewhere near the gate, and when I looked up, the yard was covered in gravestones. They glowed with a strange grayish light, and the grave closest to me read, "An evil memory of Julia Stone." As usual, I followed Jack through the hall, up the squared staircase. This time, it was darker than usual. When I entered the room, I could only see the furniture. There was also a dreadful smell of decay, and I woke up screaming. The dream continued to occur at random intervals for 15 years. Sometimes I'd have it 2 or 3 nights in a row. Aside from the 6-month break, it happened roughly once a month on average. It always ended with the same awful terror, and each experience frightened me as badly as the first. There was also a strange and dreadful consistency to it. The characters aged regularly. There were deaths and marriages in the silent family, and after Mrs. Stone died, I never saw her again. But it was still her voice that spoke to me. I could always see her gravestone just outside the iron gate. It was the same with the married daughter. Usually she was not present, but once or twice she returned with a man, and I thought it was her husband. He, too, was always silent. But due to the constant repetition of the dream, I stopped thinking that was significant. I never met Jack Stone again, nor did I ever see a dark house that resembled the one in my dream. Then, something happened. This year, I was in London until the end of July. During the first week of August, I left to stay with a friend. He had rented a summer house in the Ashdown Forest district of Sussex. John Clinton planned to meet me at the Forest Row station, and we spent the day golfing before he drove us to his house at roughly 5 that evening. Since it was still so early, we waited to have tea at home instead of having it at the clubhouse. The weather had been hot and wonderfully fresh that day, but it became stagnant and oppressive during our drive. I felt that indescribable sense of ominous anxiety that I get before a storm. John, however, did not share my concerns. He blamed my attitude on the fact that I lost both the matches. Regardless, I turned out to be right. But I do not think that that night's thunderstorm was the only cause of my depression. Our road ran through a deep valley, and I fell asleep quickly. I only woke when the motor stopped. Partly frightened, but mostly curious, I found myself standing in front of my dream house. I wondered if I was dreaming at that moment when we walked through a low, oak-paneled hall and out to the lawn. Tea was being served in the house's shadow. It was surrounded by flower beds and a gated brick wall. Beyond that was an area with rough grass and a walnut tree. The front of the house was very long, and one end had a 3-story tower that was noticeably older than the rest. It was no longer like the dream. There was no silent and terrible family. Instead, there was a large group of very cheerful people, and I knew them all. I did not feel frightened in real life like I normally did in the dream, but I was very curious about what would happen. We drank tea, and before long, Mrs. Clinton stood up. At that moment, I knew what she was going to say. She told me, "John will show you to your room in the tower." For half a second, the horror from my dreams consumed me again, but quickly passed, and the intense curiosity returned. It did not take long to satisfy. John turned to me. "It's at the top of the house, but I think you'll be comfortable. The other rooms are already taken. Would you like to see it now?" He looked up as he said this. "My goodness, I believe you're right. There's going to be a thunderstorm. It's gotten quite dark," he added. I rose and followed him as we passed through the hall and up the perfectly familiar staircase. I entered when he opened the door and was immediately struck with another wave of sheer terror. Suddenly, I remembered my fear of Mrs. Stone and her grave's sinister inscription. An evil memory. I saw it often in my sleep, just past the lawn beneath my window. Then, once again, fear passed, and I was left sane and sober inside the tower room, the very same room from my dream. I looked around with a sense of familiarity and found that nothing had been changed from my dream. The bed was angled along the wall to the left of the door. Next to it was the fireplace and a small bookcase. Across from the door were 2 lattice-paneled windows with a vanity between them. On the 4th wall was the washing stand and a big cupboard. My luggage was already unpacked. My night clothes were laid neatly on the washstand, and my dinner clothes were spread out atop the bed. With a sudden jolt of dismay, I saw 2 things I'd never seen in my dreams. One was a life-size oil painting of Mrs. Stone hanging next to the bed, and the other was a black and white sketch of Jack Stone as he had appeared in my dreams a week before, a secretive, evil-looking man of about 30 His picture hung between the windows, staring straight across the room at the other portrait. I also looked at it, and once again, I was filled with the horror from my nightmares. It showed Mrs. Stone as I had last seen her in my dreams, old, withered, and white-haired. Despite her obviously feeble body, a dreadful vitality was beneath her fleshy shell. A malignant excitement radiated unimaginable evil from her narrow, leering eyes. It laughed with a demon-like mouth. Her face expressed an appalling humor, and her hands, clasped together on her knee, shook with joy. I also saw that it was signed in the bottom left corner and wondered who the artist could be. Looking closer, I read the inscription, Julia Stone, by Julia Stone. There was a knock at the door, and John Clinton entered. "Got everything you want?" he asked. "Rather more than I want," I said, pointing to the picture. He laughed. A hard-featured old lady. She was alone, too, I remember. Anyhow, she sure didn't flatter herself much. "But don't you see?" I said. "It's hardly a human face at all. It's the face of some witch or devil." He took a closer look. "Yes, it isn't very pleasant, especially not next to the bed, eh? Yes, I'd probably have a nightmare if I slept with that nearby. I'll have it removed if you'd like." "I really wish you would," I said. He rang the bell and a servant helped us remove the picture. It was taken onto the landing and left facing the wall. "My goodness, the old lady is heavy. I wonder if she had something on her mind," John said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. I had also noticed the picture's extraordinary weight. I was about to reply when I saw a considerable amount of blood covering my palm. "I've cut myself somehow," I said. John was slightly startled. "Huh, I have too," he said, cleaning the blood from his own hand with a handkerchief. John and I returned to the tower room and washed the blood off, but neither of us had any trace of a scratch or a cut. Once we realized this, we both had an unspoken agreement not to mention it again. Then something occurred to me that I didn't want to think about. It was only a theory, but somehow I knew John was thinking the same thing. The air grew hotter and thicker after dinner. A storm was brewing, and most of us were sitting outside on the lawn where we had tea. The night was completely dark. No light from the stars or moon could penetrate the ominous clouds covering the sky. Our group slowly dispersed. The women went to bed, men retired to the smoking room, and by 11, John and I were the only two left. All evening I had thought that there was something on his mind. Now that we were alone, he confirmed it. "Did you notice the man who helped us with the picture also had blood on his hand? Just now, I asked him if he'd cut himself, and he supposed he had, but he couldn't find an actual wound. So, where did that blood come from?" he said. Up to that point, I had succeeded in not thinking about it, and I especially did not want to be reminded of it at bedtime. "I don't know. I don't really care as long as the picture of Mrs. Stone is gone," I said. He stood. "But it's odd. Now you'll see another odd thing." His Irish Terrier came outside as we talked. The hall door was open behind us. Its bright light shined across the yard and beyond the iron gate to the walnut tree. The dog's hackles were raised, bristling with fear and rage. His lips were curled back as he growled, ready to pounce. He did not notice John or myself as he stiffly walked across the lawn to the gate. He stood there, growling, looking through the bars until he seemed to lose his nerve. With one long howl, he cowered and hurried back to the house. He does that half a dozen times a day. He sees something he both hates and fears, John said. I walked to the gate and looked over it. Something in the grass was moving, and there was a sound I couldn't immediately identify. But I soon realized it was only a purring cat. I lit a match and saw the big blue Persian prancing around excitedly just outside the gate. Its tail was raised proudly, and its eyes shined brightly as it occasionally sniffed the grass. I laughed. I'm afraid that's the end of the mystery. Here's a large cat having a party all alone. Yes, that's Darius. He spends half the day and all night there. But that's not the end of the dog mystery. He and Toby are best friends. This is only the beginning of the cat mystery. What's the cat doing there? Why is it that Darius is happy, but Toby is terrified? John said. At that moment, I remembered the horrible part of my dream, where I see through the gate. The cat was standing exactly where the white tombstone with the sinister inscription is normally located. Before I could speak, it suddenly began raining, like someone turned on a faucet. The big cat squeezed through the bars and ran into the house for shelter, where it sat in the doorway, eagerly looking out into the darkness. When John pushed it back in order to close the door, it hissed and scratched at him. With Julia Stone's picture in the hallway, the tower room did not frighten me. Feeling very sleepy, I went to bed with only a mild interest in the strange occurrences of the bleeding hands and the pet's behavior. The last thing I saw was the square, empty space where the portrait had been. There, the wallpaper was its original dark red color, but it was faded everywhere else. After blowing out my candle, I fell asleep instantly. My waking was equally instantaneous. I sat straight up, thinking a bright light had been flashed in my face, but all was pitch black. I knew I was in the room from my terrifying dreams, but the fear I felt in those did not come close to the horror that now consumed me. Thunder cracked above the house immediately after the flash, but knowing it was probably lightning that woke me did not calm my racing heart. I knew something was in the room with me, instinctively. I reached for the wall to my right. I touched the edge of a picture frame. I leapt out of bed, bumping the small table beside it, and I heard my watch, candle, and matches clatter to the floor. A blinding flash erupted from the clouds to show me the picture of Mrs. Stone was once again hanging on the wall, and the room instantly returned to blackness. In that flash, I also saw a figure leaning over the end of the bed, watching me. Its tight, white garment was spotted with mold, and its face matched the one from the portrait. Overhead, the thunder roared, and when it stopped, all was deathly still. I heard a rustling as something moved closer, and even worse, there was a rotten stench of decay. That's when a hand was laid on the side of my neck, and I heard quick, eager breaths next to my ear. Even though this thing could be touched, smelled, seen, and heard, I knew that it was not of this earth. It was something that left the body and had the power to manifest itself. Then a familiar voice spoke. I knew you would come to the room in the tower. I've been waiting for a long time. At last, you have come. Tonight, I will feast, and soon we will feast together. It said, as the quick breathing came close enough to feel on my neck. The terror had temporarily paralyzed me, but now a wild instinct of self-preservation took control. I flailed both arms wildly while kicking my legs, and I heard a small animal squeal as something soft dropped beside me with a thud. I took a few steps forward, nearly tripping over whatever lay there, and by sheer luck, I found the exit. In another second, I ran out into the landing and slammed the door behind me. At almost the same moment, another door opened somewhere below me, and John Clinton came running up the stairs with a candle in hand. "What is it?" he asked. "I sleep below you and heard a noise as if, good heavens, there's blood on your shoulder." Afterwards, he said that I stood swaying from side to side, white as a sheet, with a bloody handprint stained on my shoulder. "She's in there," I said, pointing. "The portrait is hanging where we took it from, too." He laughed at that. "My dear fellow, it was only a nightmare." He pushed by me and opened the door as I stood frozen in terror, unable to stop him or move. "Phew, what an awful smell," he said before falling silent as he entered the room. He returned almost immediately, as white as myself, and shut the door behind him. "Yes, the portrait is there, and on the floor is a thing covered in dirt and wearing the garments people are buried in. Let's get away. Quick, let's go," he said. I hardly know how I got downstairs. I was nauseous and shaking multiple times. John had to place my feet on the steps, and he often looked back in terror, but eventually we came to his room on the floor below. There, I told him what I have described in these pages. The end can be told quickly. Some of my readers may have already guessed what it was if they remember the incident at the West Folly churchyard from 8 years ago. 3 attempts were made to bury a woman who had committed suicide. Each time, the coffin was found sticking up from the ground a few days later. After the 3rd attempt, the body was buried just outside the iron gate of this woman's home. She had killed herself in the room atop of the tower, and her name was Julia Stone. The body was secretly dug up again, and the coffin was found full of blood. Well, friends, thanks for joining me for another special episode of The Darkest Hour. Whether it's your first time or you're a regular, your support means the world. We've got brand new episodes every Friday night, and keep those eyes open for those deep sleep videos. And of course, subscribe, tap the bell, and you'll never miss a thing. Special thanks to the Darkest Hour channel members: Lori TESDAHL, Sarah Marie, Robert Bailey, COLTDADDY Eagle, MALLORY Dominguez, KARI Watkins, PILAR TREDEN WIXSON, Larry Hill, RIPLEY, JOJO STARCHER, Mary Patrick, Debbie LAFRENIERE, Julie Bourdelais, Jennifer BECK, MARINA LACHNER, Make Hamilton Home, Evan Pratt, Mary Hineline, Katharine, Yes.ImtherealKatie Isabelle, Landshark, Danielle Hecht, Mama P, Keziah Pietersen, Amber Baker, Khris Lauzon, Kara Geos, Marvin Allen, ForgottenruinsTV, Raven Wolf, Carlos, Stacia Gillette, Nate Black, Jill Harper, Kathy Balkenbush, Cosmic Chick, Sierra Guerrero, Deanna Kuzma, Nathan Bremer, and Demian Forrester. A big thanks to all those who shared their stories, and a huge shout out to our patrons: Tracy S., Mary H., Tanya F., Tamara K., Monica L., Zoe Watt, Shelley B., Donald C., Marion T., Rat Girl, Alicia S., Aaron G., Nikki H., Mr. Revenant, Naz K., Brendan G., Paul T., Nicholas C., Tony P., Lizanne, Arlene F., Adrian, T.F. Parham, Jason G., Lori T., Bobo Jenkins, Rachel S., Linda W., and the Darkest Hour's newest patrons, Eric and Lynn Driftless. If you want to support The Darkest Hour in other ways, consider joining our Patreon. Check out patreon.com/thedarkesthour or click the link in the description to learn more. Stay spooky.